Okay, so before you go any further, we've got to give you the customary spoiler warning right off the top, because pretty much this entire video is going to be a spoiler for the end of House of the Dragon. But if we're going to address the lives and anatomies of dragons, we have to talk about the last Targaryen dragon that led a healthy life, Morning. By the end of the Dance of the Dragons, only one of its namesakes remained to either side. Though she wasn't large enough to impact any battles, Morning became the final symbol of Targaryen supremacy of old, for after her, we only hear of one other dragon being born, and that one didn't survive too long. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the anatomy of Morning and discussing her lifetime, but before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but it means so much to us. That's it, that's all, so without further ado, let's dive straight into it. Birth and bonding. The last healthy Targaryen dragon. At the start of the Targaryen Civil War, the youngest dragons that either side possessed were Morgul and Shrykos. Born from dragon eggs that were placed in the cradles of Aegon the Elder's twins, these dragons came into the world in 123 AC, 3 years after the birth of Rhaenyra's eldest child with Daemon. At the beginning of the dance, the second generation of princes and princesses were rather young. Aegon, for example, was only 9 years old when the war broke out, and Jaehaera and Jaehaerys were both 6. In the show, all of them are far younger, and we don't even think the latter two have dragons. In Fire and Blood, Alicent Hightower seemingly broke tradition and did not place dragon eggs in the cradles of her children. Aegon, Aemond, and Helaena claimed their dragons in their youth. Helaena revived the tradition when she became queen, for Morgul and Shrykos were born from dragon eggs she placed in their cradles, and though young Maelor was known to have an egg, he's been written out of the show entirely. This is a neat little parallel between her and the previous writer of her dragon, Dreamfire, for it was Rhaena Targaryen who began the tradition of placing dragon eggs in newborn Targaryen cribs. It looks like Stormcloud is going to be the youngest dragon in the show if Morgul and Shrykos haven't been included, and if they have been, then they're likely hatchlings or really young dragons still. In the books, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera live longer lives, so their dragons get larger and eventually end up involved in the storming of the Dragon Pit, which is one of the most harrowing events from the entire Civil War. This event pretty much spells the end for most of the living dragons that were bonded with riders. Morning was born after it, a symbol of the dawn of a new age. As for who her rider was, well, that's where things get interesting. Prince Daemon Targaryen's second marriage was to Lady Laena Velaryon, the rider of the largest dragon in the world, Vhagar. Through Laena, he had 2 daughters, and in the show, he placed a dragon's egg in their cradles. But while Baela's egg hatched into Moondancer, Rhaena's didn't hatch at all, and she would often clutch it while sitting beside fires, waiting for the day to come. It never did, and soon her father started treating her different from her sister for not having a dragon. She became a 15-year-old dragonless Targaryen princess at the start of the dance, and while that much is consistent with the books, the adjacent events are a little different. We aren't explicitly told whether Baela was present with an egg after her birth in Fire and Blood, for example, but we have to assume that she was, because her twin Rhaena had one. Rhaena's hatchling was rather sickly and it died within a few hours of its birth. Baela, on the other hand, had claimed Moondancer by the age of 13, and a year later is when her dragon was large enough for her to fly on it. Moondancer was described as the size of a warhorse at that point, and this means she couldn't have been much older than half a decade or so. This also implies that Baela lost her hatchling in the book as well, and bonded with Moondancer later in life. The outcome was the same for her sister either way, because once Baela had a dragon, Rhaena got sidelined. In the show, it's always been that way, but there's a sliver of hope for her yet. In episode 3 of season 2, she's sent to the Vale with 3 of her younger half-siblings and given 4 dragon eggs by her queen, who claims that should all come to ruin, Rhaena may be their last hope. This detail is slightly altered from the books, where Rhaenyra had already given Rhaena an egg from one of Syrax's clutches, and she gave her 3 more on her trip to the Vale. Rhaena is said to have prayed over all of them, and finally, after the first bloody wave of the war was over, her prayers were answered. It's said that the news of Morning's hatching arrived in King's Landing at the beginning of 131 AC, after Aegon had secured his throne. It's possible that Morning had been alive for a few weeks or even months by the time they learned of the hatching. As for how she hatched, well, we expect that answer will be given to us in the show. According to the timeline of the books, Rhaena spent nearly 2 years in the Vale before her dragon hatched. During that time, she charmed most of the East with her grace, but we aren't told what she does with the eggs in her possession, only that she prays over them. From everything that we've seen and read about Martin's World so far, it appears as though there are 2 to 3 major requirements for the hatching of a dragon. The first, of course, is fire. Many, in fact most, of the Targaryen dragons were born in the hatcheries of Dragonstone. These hatcheries were situated inside the Dragon Mount, and it's assumed that the volcano's heat is what led to their hatching. The second condition seems to be a bond with one that possesses the blood of the dragon. When Rhaena started the tradition of placing eggs in the cradles of young princes and princesses, she did it to accelerate the fastening of the dragon bond. But curiously enough, none of these eggs were placed in a great fire to make them hatch. You can say that the heat from the infant's body helped matters along, but we'd argue that the soul bond between the rider and the dragon is more of a contributing factor here. And the final ingredient is blood, which Daenerys combines with fire at the end of a Game of Thrones to turn her fossil eggs into living dragons. We don't think Rhaena is about to make blood sacrifices in the Vale to satisfy her desire for a dragon because A, it would turn the place against her, and B, she isn't that kind of a character. Rhaena is described as being the more ladylike of both of Daemon's daughters, so we can't really imagine her lighting up a magical pyre and throwing an innocent into it just to get things moving. What we can see happening is her putting the eggs in a really hot fire to help things along, because that's the first thing Daenerys tries with her eggs as well. In Game of Thrones, she places one of her eggs in a brazier after having a dream about waking the dragons with fire. Because her eggs are fossilized, nothing happens and she burns herself trying to take it out of the fire. But this becomes her first hint as to what she must do in order to truly hatch her eggs. Syrax's eggs aren't stone, and when we see them being sent to the Vale, they're being incubated with hot coals in a massive chest. Heat seems to be the main factor that will lead to Morning's hatching, and we even see a brief shot of a few dragon eggs placed within a huge fire in the promotional material for House of the Dragon. The positioning of those eggs is rather different from the ones Dany placed on Drogo's pyre, so we can safely assume that these are Rhaena's eggs. She must have used the fires burning in the hearths of the Eyrie and her own deep desire for a dragon to subconsciously orchestrate a birthing ritual, much like Dany. Unlike her first hatchling, this one persisted and proved to be healthy. Rhaena named her Morning, and thus began the life of the last healthy Targaryen dragon. The Light of King's Landing. Morning's initial years. Morning is described as a pale pink dragon with black horns and crests, and was presumably named after the fact that it would become the sun of the post-war era. Her egg would have matched her coloring, and so should her flames. She spent the first half year of her life in the Eyrie, the ancestral castle of House Arryn, and grew large enough to ride Rhaena's shoulder like Dany's dragons do in Season 2 of Game of Thrones. Morning did not participate in any of the final war efforts on account of her size. Well, there was only one battle that occurred after her birth, and the Blacks didn't need much help to win it. Rhaena arrived in King's Landing with Lady Jane Arryn and a massive host of Valemen that had set out from Gulltown with ships. Luckily for her, by the time she arrived, her half-brother Aegon was on the throne, and Alicent's Aegon was dead. Rhaena was reconciled with Baela after 2 years, and the tables had turned. Rhaena was now the one who had spent most of her life without a dragon. But Morning was now the only dragon in the world still under Targaryen control. It's said that the small folk of the city became ecstatic at the sight of her, which goes to show you the fickleness of people. Less than a year before that, they'd participated in the enthusiastic butchery of the Targaryen dragons housed in the dragon pit, and now they welcomed another, for they missed the splendor and the wonder of dragons. Luckily for everyone, this was the time of the false dawn, when pardons were being handed out aplenty, and all of King's Landing was glad the war was over. None tried to make an attempt on the life of Aegon III or his half-sisters, both of whom were now technically his heirs. Rhaena toured the city with her sisters and her dragon, and Morning was said to be so small at the time that she coiled about Rhaena's shoulders like a stole. Princess and Dragon stayed at the Red Keep for close to 3 years, until Morning had become large enough to make a lair of her own. In 134 AC, she flew to the ruins of the Dragon Pit and made herself a new home. Morning was 3 years old at that point, and not of flying size, let alone fighting size. That changed the next year when she turned 4 and allowed Rhaena to ride her for the very first time. Princess and Dragon did a lap around King's Landing, and every day after that, both would venture farther and wider into the skies. Though she lived at the Red Keep, Rhaena only landed her dragon inside its walls once, and after that, it's likely that she never repeated the feat again because she went into a self-imposed exile. Why Rhaena and Morning were exiled from court. King Aegon III gave the Seven Kingdoms 26 years of justice and peace, but while his reign is remembered fondly, the king himself isn't. Aegon was considered to be a rather moody and brooding character. He would often lock himself within his apartments for days and only spoke when needed in council and court. The reason for his sharpness isn't arrogance, it's severe trauma. Aegon's first flight on Stormcloud was his last, as he rode the young dragon not for flight synchronization, but to save his own life. Stormcloud was riddled with so many arrows and spears that he died shortly after reaching Dragonstone, and Aegon never took another dragon. Later, Towards the end of the dance, he saw another dragon, Sunfire, kill and devour his own mother. Since that day, Aegon developed an intense fear and hatred of dragons that wouldn't lessen until the end of his days. Shortly before Rhaena came to King's Landing from the Vale, Lord Cregan Stark had taken control of the city during the Hour of the Wolf. He kept Aegon imprisoned within Maegor's holdfast while he dispensed justice to the traitors of the city, but he allowed his half-sisters to visit him. When the young king saw Morning, he paled and asked his northern guards to get this wretched creature out of his sight. When Aegon got married at the Maiden's Day Ball, he took his new wife out to see the sights of King's Landing thrice, but avoided the Dragon Pit altogether. In the same year that Morning took up residence at the Dragon Pit, a dragon egg hatched across Blackwater Bay, the first since Morning's birth. Rhaena's sister Baela had given birth to a daughter called Laena, and keeping in line with her house's tradition, she placed a dragon egg in her cradle. However, that egg hatched a wingless worm, white as a maggot, that tore a chunk of flesh off baby Laena's body. Baela's husband hacked the creature to pieces before it did any lasting damage to her, but the incident caused King Aegon to remove all dragon eggs from King's Landing. When the king's hand, Torrhen Manderly, made preparations for his king's coming of age, Rhaena asked leave to bring Morning along, but the hand gently refused her. Aegon's trauma was understandable, his fear relatable, but by reinforcing it so vehemently, he ended up pushing his half-sister away. After Morning became large enough to ride, Rhaena landed her in the Red Keep only once, and while Aegon's queen was delighted at the sight, Aegon refused to see his sister fly on her dragon, even when his own brother insisted that he do so. Rhaena ended up departing for Dragonstone soon after, stating that she was going to a place where dragons and their riders were more welcome. This suggests that Morning's very existence caused a rift between the king and his sister, but we don't know how this was resolved or if it even was. Fire and Blood ends with the coming of age of Aegon III, and the rest of his reign will be covered in the next part of the duology, Blood and Fire. The last we heard of her, Rhaena of Pentos was still at Dragonstone, 5 years after the birth of her dragon. She wouldn't remain there for the rest of her life, and this is where the biggest question regarding Morning's life emerges. How did Morning die? The mysterious fate of the last dragon from the dance. Morning was not an especially large dragon. In fact, she had only grown large enough to ride at the age of 4, and when she turned 5, Rhaena was 19. You must have noticed that we keep calling Morning her, and that's because she's always been described as a she-dragon in most accounts of her life. The pale pink and black dragon wasn't especially threatening in the year 136, but she could have reopened wounds that took the realm years to heal had she been unleashed in battle, and there was a reason for Rhaena to unleash Morning. During her stay in the Vale, Rhaena had become especially close to Corwyn Corbray. When she returned to court, she was asked to marry on account of her being Aegon's successor, and she chose Corwyn for her husband. The pair were married in 132 AC, and had even lost a child together before Aegon's marriage, but Corwyn remained Rhaena's knight in shining armor. That is, until the time he joined Aegon's Council of Regents and became his protector of the realm. During the reign of the Regents, the Iron Islands and the Vale of Arryn both experienced succession struggles, and Corwyn was sent forth to deal with the latter. He ended up dying in battle, and Baela arrived at Dragonstone to both comfort her sister and ensure she didn't ride Morning into battle. Rhaena's she-dragon was nowhere near large enough to turn the tide of an entire battle, but she certainly could have burned her enemies to death. Daenerys' Drogon becomes large enough to fly and kill scores of people during the events that unfold at Daznak's pit, and it isn't too much of a stretch to imagine that the sight of a dragon would unman the defenders of the Arryn pretenders. Morning was younger than Stormcloud, but Rhaena was older than Aegon had been when his dragon carried him to safety, and she would have probably avenged Corwyn's death too had Baela not talked her down. After this, we don't hear a word about Morning or Rhaena from the histories except for two important developments. At some point, we don't know when, but Rhaena remarries, and it's the house she marries into that's rather interesting. Rhaena's second husband is Garmund Hightower, third son of Ormond Hightower, nephew to former Hand Otto Hightower, and cousin to Queen Alicent Hightower. The other is the fact that within 18 years of Rhaena's last flight, the last Targaryen dragon would die, and that wasn't Morning. The last dragon was a small, sickly, and stunted green female with withered wings. She lived in King's Landing and died in 153 AC, but not before laying a clutch of 5 eggs that were already hard as stone, according to Sir Arlen of Pennytree. When Tyrion Lannister visits the Red Keep and sees the skulls of the Targaryen dragons, he remarks that the smallest were no bigger than the head of a mastiff. This might be an inconsistency, because back in the first book, George said there was a pair of last dragons, but every subsequent piece of material related to the series has referred to said dragon in the singular. But as you might have realized, this isn't the coloring of Morning. Morning is a pale pink dragon with black horns, claws, and crest. By 153 AC, she should have been just over 20 years old, large and thriving, a symbol of Targaryen might returned to the world. Yet we hear nothing of her when people think about the last dragon. So what exactly happened to Morning then? Well, our prevailing theory is that she was killed by the Hightowers. Rhaena was widowed in 136 AC, and the last dragon died in 153 AC. That's 17 years later, and she could have married Garmund at any point during that period. Relations between the Iron Throne and the Hightowers remained surprisingly cordial after the dance, despite the fact that the latter lost all its political advantages over the royal court. Ormond's successor attended Aegon's wedding and even hosted his unofficial master of ships, Alan Valerian. Yes, that Alan Valerian. In the year that Rhaena's husband died, Ormond's successor even visited King's Landing to vote on the members for Aegon's Council of Regents. But the Hightowers must not have forgotten their losses, for it can only be after Rhaena marries Garmund that her dragon's life would be put in danger. And that danger would have come from the Maesters. In A Feast for Crows, Samwell Tarly meets an archmaester called Marwyn the Mage, who's the only man in the Citadel bold enough to pursue truth rather than enlightened crap. Marwyn claims that the last Targaryen dragons weren't killed by gallant dragon slayers, but rather the Maesters of the Citadel. On first listen, it feels like he's talking about the dance of the dragons and the storming of the dragon pit, and while that might be true, we know the actual last known healthy dragon in the world was Morning. Since Morning was a she-dragon, we can assume that the green dragon that died in 153 AC was born from one of her clutches. This can explain why she was stunted with a misshapen skull no bigger than a mastiff's, because it is very possible that the Maesters of the Citadel poisoned Morning in some way. Rhaena and Garmund's marriage bore many children, 6 to be precise, but that also meant that she was tied to the birthing bed for a good while. There are hints that suggest that the dance itself was engineered by the Maesters, and House of the Dragon has made both Mellos and Orwyle feel like agents of the Citadel rather than honest advisors. If Morning had taken residence at Old Town after Rhaena's marriage to Garmund, it would leave her wide open to a poisoning attempt from the Maesters, who wanted to create a world devoid of magic and its powers. Now, you might ask why they would do that if the realms were at peace, and why they didn't poison any other dragon that stayed at the city for an extended period of time. Well, the short answer is the status quo was never in their favor. Earlier, the Targaryens had enough dragons and riders to make up for the death of one, and if foul play was suspected, the Maesters would have been burnt to death. But Morning was alone and in their backyard. If they poisoned her somehow, that could also explain why the last dragon was born stunted and sickly, and why her eggs never hatched. Morning was her mother in all likelihood, and if she was carrying the Maester's poison in her body when she whelped her egg, the poison would have been passed down to her as well. The Pink Beauty clearly died a while before her offspring, but this poisoning theory could explain a few things about why the last dragon was found in King's Landing. Aegon III had commanded all dragons and dragon eggs removed from his city early in his reign, but as he grew older, he came to realize that his fear and trauma was holding his realm back. Aegon recognized the need for dragons if the House of the Dragon were to stay alive, and he'd suffered enough treasons growing up in the shadow of war. At one point, at the behest of his brother Viserys, he sends for 9 mages from Essos who cross the narrow sea and work spells over his eggs. It proves to be useless, and Aegon himself dies 4 years after the last dragon. He was called Dragonbane, not only because dragons went extinct during his reign, but also for his famed fear of them. Then why did he change his opinion on them and actually try to revive them? Well, there's 2 possibilities. 1, Aegon had a dragon dream that told him to do so, or 2, Morning arrived in King's Landing sick and dying, and he realized what he was losing out on by isolating dragons from his reign. It would make a lot of sense for Aegon to allow the last dragon to roost in the city with her eggs when he hated them a few years ago because he'd had a rude wake-up call. Septon Barth once claimed that death doesn't go down a dragon's gullet, but food does, and if Morning's food was spiked with something like the Strangler or Manticore venom, the possibility of her getting poisoned skyrockets. The Maesters would have knowledge of these poisons, of course, and perhaps even supplies of them. They also possess a rare tome called Blood and Fire, colloquially known as the Death of Dragons, which supposedly has all kinds of information on the beasts, especially how to kill them. So the Maesters will have the knowledge, and thanks to House Hightower's grudge, the backing to pull off such a scheme. Or maybe that's just a conspiracy, and Rhaena just passes away one day, and Morning flies out into the Sunset Sea, never to be seen again, and the last dragon is born from some other dragon's egg. That's a definite possibility, but we kind of prefer the first version because it would tie things up so beautifully beautifully, and it would prove to the world that dragons aren't as infallible as they seem. Ironically enough, Morning ends up being the last son of the Targaryen dragons, for after her falls the Long Night. Marvelous verdict. But that's enough out of us about a dragon we won't even see until the end of the show. What do you guys think about Morning and its curious life and anatomy? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. This is Wheezy249 signing off, and until next time, don't forget, history is written in fire and blood.